The relationship between price and book value has always attracted the attention of investors. Stocks selling for well below the book value of equity have generally been considered undervalued, while those selling for more than book value have been targeted as overvalued. This video begins by examining the price-book value ratio in more detail, the determinants of this ratio, and how best to evaluate or estimate the ratio. The market value of the equity in a firm reflects the market's expectation of the firm's earning power and cash flows. The book value of equity is the difference between the book value of assets and the book value of liabilities, a number that is largely determined by accounting conventions. In the United States, the book value of assets is the original price paid for the assets reduced by any allowable depreciation on the assets. Consequently, the book value of an asset generally decreases as it ages. The book value of liabilities similarly reflects the at-issue values of the liabilities. Since the book value of an asset reflects its original cost, it might deviate significantly from market value if the earning power of the asset has increased or declined significantly since its acquisition. There are several reasons why investors find the price-book value ratio useful in investment analysis. The first is that the book value provides a relatively stable, intuitive measure of value that can be compared to the market price. For investors who instinctively mistrust discounted cash flow estimates of value, the book value is a much simpler benchmark for comparison. The second is that, given reasonably consistent accounting standards across firms, price-book value ratios can be compared across similar firms for signs of under or overvaluation. Finally, even firms with negative earnings, which cannot be valued using price-earnings ratios, can be evaluated using price-book value ratios. There are far fewer firms with negative book value for equity than there are firms with negative earnings. There are several disadvantages associated with measuring and using price-book value ratios. First, book values, like earnings, are affected by accounting decisions on depreciation and other variables. When accounting standards vary widely across firms, the price-book value ratios may not be comparable. A similar statement can be made about comparing price-book value ratios across countries with different accounting standards. Second, book value may not carry much meaning for service and technology firms that do not have significant tangible assets. Third, the book value of equity can become negative if a firm has a sustained string of negative earnings reports, leading to a negative price-book value ratio. Definition: the price-to-book ratio is computed by dividing the market price per share by the current book value of equity per share. While the multiple is fundamentally consistent, the numerator and denominator are both equity values. There is a potential for inconsistency if you are not careful about how you compute book value of equity per share. In particular, first, if there are multiple classes of shares outstanding, the price per share can be different for different classes of shares, and it is not clear how the book equity should be apportioned among shares. Second, you should not include the portion of the equity that is attributable to preferred stock in computing the book value of equity, since the market value of equity refers only to common equity. Moving on, the price-book value ratio can be related to the same fundamentals that determine value in discounted cash flow models. Since this is an equity multiple, we will use an equity discounted cash flow model, the dividend discount model, to explore the determinants. Rewriting in terms of the PBV ratio, you can look at the formula on the slide. The PBV ratio is an increasing function of the return on equity, the payout ratio, and the growth rate, and a decreasing function of the riskiness of the firm. The price-book value ratio of a stable firm is determined by the differential between the return on equity and its cost of equity. If the return on equity exceeds the cost of equity, the price will exceed the book value of equity. If the return on equity is lower than the cost of equity, the price will be lower than the book value of equity. The value of equity of a high-growth firm in the two-stage dividend discount model can be written as value of equity equals present value of expected dividends plus present value of terminal price. The left-hand side of the equation is the price-book value ratio. It is determined by, first, return on equity. The price-book value ratio is an increasing function of the return on equity. Second, payout ratio during the high growth period and in the stable period. The PBV ratio increases as the payout ratio increases for any given growth rate. Third, riskiness. Through the discount rate R, the PBV ratio becomes lower as riskiness increases. The increased risk increases the cost of equity. Fourth, growth rate in earnings in both the high growth and stable phases. The PBV increases as the growth rate increases in either period. Holding the payout ratio constant. This formula is general enough to be applied to any firm, even one that is not paying dividends right now. Note, in addition, that the fundamentals that determine the price-to-book ratio are the same as they were for a stable growth firm: the payout ratio, the return on equity, the expected growth rate, and the cost of equity. There are several potential applications for the principles developed in the preceding section, and we will consider 3 in this section. We will first look at what causes price-to-book ratios for entire markets to change over time, and when a low or high price-to-book ratio for a market can be viewed as a sign of undervaluation or overvaluation. We will next compare the price-to-book ratios of firms within a sector, and extend this to look at firms across the market and what you need to control for in making these comparisons. Finally, we will look at the factors that cause the price-to-book ratio of an individual firm to change over time and how this can be used as a tool for analyzing restructurings. PBV ratios for a market. The price-to-book value ratio for an entire market is determined by the same variables that determine the price-to-book value ratio for an individual firm. Other things remaining equal, therefore, you would expect the price-to-book ratio for a market to go up as the equity return spread, ρ minus cost of equity, earned by firms in the market increases. Conversely, you would expect the price-to-book ratio for the market to decrease as the equity return spread earned by firms decreases. Comparisons across firms in a sector. Price-book value ratios vary across firms for a number of reasons: different expected growth, different payout ratios, different risk levels, and most importantly, different returns on equity. Comparisons of price-book value ratios across firms that do not take into account these differences are likely to be flawed. The most common approach to estimating PBV ratios for a firm is to choose a group of comparable firms, to calculate the average PBV ratio for this group, and to base the PBV ratio estimate for a firm on this average. The adjustments made to reflect differences in fundamentals between the firm being valued and the comparable group are usually made subjectively. There are several problems with this approach. First, the definition of a comparable firm is essentially a subjective one. The use of other firms in the industry as the control group is often not a complete solution because firms within the same industry can have very different business mixes and risk and growth profiles. There is also plenty of potential for bias. Second, even when a legitimate group of comparable firms can be constructed, differences will continue to persist in fundamentals between the firm being valued and this group. Adjusting for differences subjectively does not provide a satisfactory solution to this problem, since these judgments are only as good as the analysts making them. Given the relationship between price-book value ratios and returns on equity, It should not be surprising to see firms that have high returns on equity sell for well above book value and firms that have low returns on equity sell at or below book value. The firms that should draw attention from investors are those that provide mismatches of price-book value ratios and returns on equity, low PBV ratios and high ROE, or high PBV ratios and low ROE. There are two ways in which we can bring home these mismatches: a matrix approach and a sector regression. Comparing firms across the market in contrast to the comparable firm approach. You could look at how firms are priced across the entire market to predict PBV ratios for individual firms. The simplest way of summarizing this information is with a multiple regression, with the PBV ratio as the dependent variable and proxies for risk, growth, return on equity, and payout forming the independent variables. Comparing a firm's PBV ratio across time as a firm's return on equity changes over time, you would expect its price-to-book ratio to also change. Specifically, firms that increase their returns on equity should increase their price-to-book ratios, and firms that see their returns on equity deteriorate should see a fall in their price-to-book ratios as well. Thank you.